We have eminent leaders from the industry who come and speak to our students here about the industry trends and, more importantly, about what it takes to be a good and effective leader. Here are some of the leaders who have visited our campus and interacted with our students. And today, we are thrilled to have with us Mr. Pallab Talukdar, the CEO of Fujitsu India. I'd request our Dean, Dr. Anil Rao, to kindly welcome Mr. Talukdar with a bouquet of flowers.
I would now like to introduce our guest for the evening. Mr. Pallab Talukdar has over 22 years of experience in the IT industry and has served in various sales and marketing positions both in India as well as in the Asia Pacific region. Mr. Talukdar started his career in the IT industry with Wipro Infotech, where his career spanned over 7 years. Currently, Mr. Talukdar has the responsibility for growing and managing Fujitsu India's portfolio of client products like servers, storage solutions and service business. Prior to this, Mr. Talukdar was Director for Enterprise Business in Dell India. Before Dell, he was Director, Marketing and Alliances in the Technology Solutions Group in HP India. He also managed HP's business critical servers and Compact's portfolio of servers and storage. Mr. Talukdar holds a bachelor's degree in Electronics and Communications Engineering from IIT Kharagpur and postgraduate diploma in management from IIM Calcutta. His hobbies include reading and traveling. I would now request Mr. Talukdar to please address our students.
Thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure, absolutely a pleasure to be standing amongst all of you. And I just had a very brief glimpse of your. I had a very brief tour of your beautiful campus, and I was just commenting to Professor Rao that this is probably the most advanced campus I've seen. Okay, so I think you people are really lucky to have a campus like this. And I think the location of Electronic City in the city of Bangalore, I think, is really a very privileged location, right? So really congratulations that you are studying in such a great institute over here. What I would want to do over the next, say, 30-35 minutes is to give you a little overview in terms of what's really happening in the IT industry. As you saw from the background that was shared with all of you, I have really been a part of the Indian IT industry almost ever since it started. And it has given me a very good opportunity to have a ringside view of how this industry actually came about. I would also touch very briefly in terms of what I see happening in the world of technology and how different areas are converging together. And this is something which is very important because we believe that it will have a profound impact on the way people work, people get entertained, people are productive, etc. over the next 15-20 years. And that is something which will definitely throw up its own set of business challenges, etc., which I'm sure all of you will be in a position to capitalize on. So let me start the, is the presentation working? Oh. Yeah, I think that's good. Yes. So just to give you a little background about how this Indian industry started off, and I think it's a pretty fascinating story. I don't know if you're aware, before the 1990s, we were in a socialist kind of an economy, right? I'm sure all of you are familiar with that. And one of the consequences of that was that computers were always looked upon as something which was very elitist, with something that replaces labor. And it was absolutely not the flavor of our country in the 70s and in the 80s. The first change came with Rajiv Gandhi coming to power in 1984. But before that, if you really look at it, the computers were discouraged, one, because there was really no domestic computer makers in the country. And secondly, the import duty on computers were very high. To my recollection, they were in excess of 250%. Just think about it. Okay? So in effect, there was really no computers in our country. There were only a very few computers that were there in some of the top educational institutions. And there was a few commercial organizations which were using computers. But the numbers could be counted really, in tens and hundreds. It was certainly not more than that. Of course, the entire industry itself was in some respect like that, because computers, even worldwide, were very expensive commodities, and it was something which was typically in a glass house, and people had to have special training to be able to access a computer and to be able to use a computer. So interestingly, you know, how computers initially started off in India was when companies like HCL and DCM first started off by making electronic calculators, and then from calculators they took a jump into computers. I'm sure some of this you must have read and you're familiar with that background. And I'm talking about an era where there was no PCs. You know, today when you think about computer, everybody talks about a PC and a laptop, but we're talking about an era where there was really no PCs, correct? Now, in that era, when we are talking in the late 70s and early 80s, when, you know, computers were so expensive, and there was also no standardization of computers. That is also, from a technology perspective, a very important factor. That there was really no standardization as far as computers were concerned. Every company, for example, if you take the big companies of those days, which was an IBM, a Digital, right, or a Data General, these kind of companies, all of them had a very unique architecture. The computers were not meant to talk to each other. Everybody's computers were unique. Everybody's computers was a complete stack of proprietary hardware, proprietary software, and so on and so forth. I'm sorry, I should. So that is how, you know, the computer industry itself was, because PCs, if you all recall, was actually introduced by IBM only in 1981. Now, in the Indian context, when people like HCL and in 1981 Wipro got established and DCM, when they started building up computers, the first design of computers were computers which were rigged together by getting, you know, pieces and components from all over the world. Keep in mind, there was no standard operating system as well, right? There was no Microsoft, there was no Unix, so no Linux obviously, and so on and so forth. So everything was very proprietary. And that was the small industry that took shape in this country in the early 80s. I must tell you, when I joined Wipro in 1987, a year after my graduation, Wipro was a 20 crore company. Today we talk about Wipro being almost a 40,000 crore company, but that time Wipro was a 20 crore company. And you know, it is also very remarkable how businesses develop. So, you know, obviously, if you think of computers, the first usage scenario comes is banks, right? Because banks obviously deal in large volumes of data, there is need for automation. But the situation in the Indian market was such that even the word computer was a word that people didn't want to use. So very innovatively, people started calling a computer as a ledger posting machine. Okay, because they said this is typically used at the end of the day to balance your ledger, and therefore it was called a ledger posting machine. And when the next generation of computer came, it was called an advanced ledger posting machine, and so on and so forth. But sometime around the mid 80s, I think 86, 87 time period, people realized that, you know, just by reconciling a branch accounts is not adequate, because at the end of the day, the companies have to consolidate their daily reports, right? And as you know, in branch you have the branches, then you have the regional offices, the zonal offices, and then the head office. And it was a huge task, because we are not talking about an environment where there was any networking. So I still remember when I joined the industry, there was a, you know, the media, the only exchangeable media was an 8-inch floppy drive, which used to be this big, right? And these 8-inch floppy drives from different branches would be couriered overnight to a local office or a local branch of zonal office, and then they would get consolidated, and the next day they will again travel from that zonal office to a regional office, and then the third day it will go to the head office. So that was the kind of chain that we had in terms of even consolidating the data. And because of union pressures, etc., the word computer could not be used. Keep in mind, these were all ledger posting machines. Okay, so that is how it all started. But then somewhere down the road, RBI came out with a guideline which said that all Indian banks must get into a computerization, and they must have some bigger systems for running these batch consolidations in the larger offices, the larger zonal offices and the regional offices. And they went to the extent of even specifying what processor the system should have, what operating system the system should use, and so on and so forth. Now, in those days, and I'm still talking about an era where there was no standardization of operating system, and Microsoft was still a very, very small company. PCs had still not become a standard. That time, there was an operating system called Unix, and this operating system was owned by AT&T. And AT&T used to license out this operating system for a fee of $1,000. So technically speaking, anybody can go out and buy a copy of this Unix source code for just $1,000. And therefore, Government of India felt that this is the cheapest operating system that we can get, and they mandated that all these banks must use a Unix operating system. So all the companies at that point in time, which was HCL, Wipro, DCM, everybody rushed and spent that $1,000 and got a copy of that Unix operating system. Now the interesting thing about Unix operating system, which was later on turned out to be a very prophetic decision, was it was based on a language called C, which later on became the common language for most computer programming, and inadvertently gave India a head start in terms of C language programming and Unix programming, which later on became a world standard. So it all happened accidentally, it all happened because of a very peculiar diktat from Reserve Bank of India, going to the extent of mandating what the processor and what the operating system would be. So this is how this industry started, and as I said, it was a small industry, 20 crore, 40 crore and so on and so forth. I still remember the early days when in Wipro, I don't know if some of you have heard, there's a very visionary leader in Wipro who is no longer with Wipro now. He runs his own company, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Sridhar Mitta. Dr. Mitta at that point in time was the head of Wipro R&D. And Dr. Mitta had this vision that, if we can do these kind of developmental work, so pretty much the entire computer got designed within the country, right? Because components came from different vendors, operating system was done in-house, along with the operating systems, all the extensions that you would typically use, your drivers, etc., were all written. So he felt that there was something which we were getting good at, and maybe it's a job that some of the American companies don't want to do. And this thought process led to the concept of an outsourcing, where they went out and said to people like NCR and Sequent, etc., these are not the tier 1 technology companies in those days, but the tier 2 technology companies who are obviously under cost pressure in the United States, saying, can we not in Wipro or in India take some of these tasks and do it at a cheaper cost for you? And that was really the foundation of the outsourcing industry that we start talking about. And this I'm again talking about a time period of the 90s, which is before the Y2K bug became a big issue and the Indian software industry capitalized in terms of doing projects for Y2K bug fixing. So this is how, ladies and gentlemen, the whole IT industry started off. And then, of course, after the 1990s happened and the Y2K issue got resolved and Indian companies got a lot of limelight across the globe in terms of very successfully navigating the world away from catastrophe in terms of the Y2K problem, that Indian companies really started making a name for themselves. And against a lot of people who says, no, Indians are not good at high-level programming, Indians can only do low-level programming and that to pure coding work, there is no strategic input. I think companies like Infosys, Wipro, and all the others went out and proved the whole world wrong. And I'm sure today each one of us feels very proud about what the IT industry has achieved over the course of last 20-25 years. So it's very interesting to see that this industry itself is about a 30-year-old industry, and as we said, it started off in the early 80s, and today it's an industry which I think probably is the most well-known industry of India outside of India. Okay? And as you are all aware of, that while the initial wave was led by Indian companies like Wipros and HCLs and so on and so forth, very soon the multinational companies also realized that they are missing out if they don't have a presence in India. And then you have a flood of the IBMs and the Hewlett-Packards and the Fujitsus of the world coming in to start looking to leverage the talent that was in India, right? And today, of course, everybody knows Indians are smart, etc., thanks, I think, to a large extent, the work that the IT industry did. Okay? So this is how this whole industry has evolved, and that's one background which I wanted to share with you. The second interesting thing is, of course, how the technology itself is evolving. And what I will do is I'll probably take a few thoughts from the slides which are over here and weave in the story in terms of how we see the technology evolving. Okay. So, before we start the story, I just thought I'll put a context of Fujitsu also into this picture. And this is again a very interesting story because, sometimes history really teaches you how companies evolve and how strategies evolve. Okay? Fujitsu, as you can see from here, is a very old company. It's a 75-year-old company. A lot of people believe that Fujitsu has something to do with Mount Fuji. It is actually not correct. The name Fujitsu starts off in a very interesting way. it started off as a copper mining company called Furukawa Copper Mining. Okay? Furukawa is a fairly common family name in Japan. Now, when you mined copper in the late 19th century, you had to do something with that copper, right? So Fujitsu or Furukawa at that point in time went and tied up with Siemens, which was obviously even a big company in those days, to make electrical machinery for Japan. I'm talking about the year 1923. Okay. And this company was called Furukawa Siemens Electric. Now, Japanese people have a problem. They can't pronounce the word Siemens. They call it Siemens. Okay. So Furukawa, the FU of Fujitsu comes from Furukawa, and the JI is actually SI of Siemens. Okay. So it became FU SI Electric, which was called Fuji Electric. And then in 1935, they realized that you can use copper better by participating in the new emerging telecom industry by making switches and cables and so on and so forth. And that was the genesis of Sushinki, which is the word for telecom in Japanese language. So that is how Fujitsu is. It's Furukawa, Siemens, Sushinki. The letters form the word Fujitsu. So we started off in 1935, and then we were pretty much a telecom operator till the 1960s or mid-60s, when we pioneered computers in Japan around the time that IBM pioneered computers in the US. Right? So Japan's first computer, Japan's first mainframe computer, Japan's first supercomputer, etc., were all designed by Fujitsu. And from those days till today, Fujitsu continues to be one of the world leaders as far as IT is concerned, and definitely the largest IT company in Japan. Now, interestingly, of course, during this period of transition, telecom became a very mature industry. At least the landline part of the telecom industry became very mature, right? There was not many major investment going and so on and so forth. And Fujitsu's own revenue stream that used to come from telecom over time declined. And today, if you see out of the $55 billion business that we have at a worldwide level, almost 85% of it is IT related, and only about 10-15% is telecom related. In telecom, of course, we also changed over, and today the landline business pretty much is not there. We make mobile handsets like a lot of other people. Some of you might be surprised to know that Fujitsu is actually the second largest smartphone maker in Japan. So we actually compete with the likes of Samsungs and Apples there. But having said that, Japanese people followed a very different standard. Japan does not have a GSM standard or a CDMA standard. And Japan was way ahead in terms of making use of internet for data connectivity, right, for data transfers. And Fujitsu obviously kept adopting to the Japanese standard, but in the process they also missed out on the GSM and the CDMA standards that became popular in the rest of the world. So today, therefore, our entire telecom business is restricted to Japan, and we have not been able to adopt to participate in the telecom revolution that took place in countries like India and China and so on and so forth. So it again shows that if you are closed on a technology front, you lose out. And between you and me, we have lost out in Fujitsu as far as the telecom business is concerned. So this is how the company is, and as you can see, it has all the characteristics of a typical multinational company in terms of a global presence, large number of people, R&D labs across the length and breadth of the country. But there are a couple of things which I want to specifically highlight over here. You will also see that typically we are spending about 5% of our revenues in R&D. Now, this is a matter of tremendous debate and differentiation in the IT industry. Companies like Fujitsu obviously believe that R&D gives you innovation, innovation gives you a competitive advantage, time to market advantage, etc., and therefore innovation is good. There are other examples of companies, and I don't want to take competition names over here, people who very famously have gone on record to say that innovation is really not required. What is more critical are things like supply chain and operations and so on and so forth. And they have very consciously stayed away from really spending big amount of money on innovation. But the reality today is, in my own assessment, and I think it becomes clearer as we get along in our discussion, that R&D spend in a high-tech industry is the lifeline. Because as we will see shortly, the industry is evolving at a very rapid rate, and we keep talking about IT industry being a very fast-moving industry, and we can take enough examples of companies where if you have not innovated, if you have not stayed in touch with what is currently happening, you tend to miss out. I think the most recent example all of you can relate to very easily is the fortunes of Nokia. right? You have all seen, I think just 3-4 years back, Nokia was a clear market leader, but Nokia's inability to read the shift towards smartphones, right? And their inability to invest in an operating system which had good interfaces, right? Symbian was obviously not designed for a smartphone usage, is what has now led to a situation where they have, lost significant market share and so on and so forth. Correct? So this is again a problem that you have in the IT industry, that if you don't catch on to the right technology at the right time, and some of it is indeed very difficult to predict, because I don't think before iPad came in the market, people had even given a second thought about the future of the tablet market. Tablets, as all of you are aware, has actually been around for last 10 years, correct? But it was really that iPad which came and changed the rules of the game in terms of how tablet became such a popular device as far as internet consumption is concerned. It still does not replace a notebook, because it cannot be a very good device in terms of creating content. But it's a great device for consuming the content, which is where iPads have become so popular. Right? And of course, today we see in the world there is a big fight between the two big proponents. One is the Apple world and the Android world, right? All of you are reading about that. So these are important trends, sometimes which people obviously miss. Just to put this on record, Fujitsu actually invented tablet. And the name iPad was originally registered by Fujitsu. Can you believe this? And once again, I think, I'm bringing this to the point, and though I'm standing here as a Fujitsu representative, but the point is, sometimes if you become very insular, which Japanese companies tend to become, because they believe in, their culture is also a very inward-looking culture, you tend to miss out on the global trends. And therefore, I think as new leaders, all of you have to keep one thing in mind. Keep your eyes open of what's happening around the world. If you close your eyes, you're finished. Okay? And finally, I don't know if you're aware, it was there in the press, we had out-of-court settlement with Apple on the usage of we gave the name iPad to Apple, and of course for a certain settlement, but that's the reality. Okay, so this is how, sometimes technology trends come which people don't anticipate, and this can have completely catastrophic effect in the way the business gets done. Okay, so this is something which is as an introductory point about Fujitsu. Let me share with you what we believe as the overall goal of Fujitsu. So the philosophy is that through a constant pursuit of innovation, and this is very critical because as a company vision, we are clearly committed to innovation. The Fujitsu Group aims to contribute to the creation of a networked society that is rewarding and secure, bringing about a prosperous future that fulfills the dream of people throughout the world. If you read this vision statement, I'm sure there are enough courses and case studies which you do in terms of reading a vision statement of a company. Look at this vision statement. It very clearly lays down a very, very noble, wide global dream. If you read the vision statement, it leaves in no doubt in terms of where the company wants to go, right? And it is not talking anywhere about a computer. It is talking about, or a IT. It is talking about creating a network society of human beings who can cooperate with each other to create a better future for themselves, right? A very lofty vision, and as we go forward, we will see that how some of the local demographic pressures of Japan as a society are compelling Fujitsu to create technologies which perhaps in the Indian context we can't relate to, but at some point in time, as India also becomes an aging society, it will become important the way we do our own lives. Okay, so this is something which I just want you to keep at the back of your mind, and we will come back and draw the correlation as we go forward. So, if you really look in terms of how we see how Fujitsu sees the world of IT shifting. When computers initially started, as we said, these were all silos, there was very little networking and so on and so forth, and you really had to be a PhD to be able to use a computer, right? And from there on, and I'm sure from the time when all of you people have got educated and grown up, you have always seen the world of a networked computer, right? There was always a network, there was always an Ethernet, there was always a connectivity of some sort. And of course, in the last few years, we have seen mobile connectivity as the default connectivity, but very clearly we are today living in a society where everything is networked. But what is very interesting is that what is now going to change, just not a connectivity between the device and the human, but there will be an enormous jump in the amount of communication that will take place between one device and another device, which in the industry we are talking about a machine-to-machine communication, right? And when you look in terms of what we are talking about in the human-centric computing, we believe that technology will become so embedded that at a human level you will not be able to differentiate as to where a device or a technology ends and where a human interface starts. It will be one seamless connectivity. And if you really look in terms of the building blocks of what we believe is taking us to a world of human-centric computing, these are terminologies which I'm sure all of you are now reading about and talking about, which is cloud computing, sensor technology, ubiquitous terminals, mobile communications, and so on and so forth. So the vision is, how do you take all these different technologies together and weave it into a seamless experience for the customer. And some of them are absolutely amazing in terms of the new values that it can create, as I said, from an education, entertainment, productivity perspective. So if you really look now in terms of communications, traditionally we have seen people and IT systems talking to each other. But what we are now headed towards is a greater reliance on natural interfaces. And I'm talking some examples of, say, a voice interface. We are talking about examples of handwriting interface, gesture interfaces where the computer or the terminal can interpret your gestures, hand movement, eye movement. You have all seen the new Samsung Galaxy S3 ad, right? It scans your eyes and checks whether you're looking at it and so on and so forth. It will have a sensing now which is increasingly going to depend around the environment. That means, a physical environment in the form of temperature, weather conditions, atmospheric pressure, and so on and so forth. People are talking to the extent of very sensitive altimeters now coming into a PC, into a mobile phone, where it can tell you which floor of the building you are in just by measuring the air pressure, right? Or it can even get into a behavioral interface where you can start tracking things like blood pressure, your sweat levels, right? It can track if your blood pressure is increasing in a particular situation, so that it actually starts then predicting your behavior. It can track your breathing rate, it can track your blood sugar levels, and so on and so forth. That means one single interface can now track not only about what's happening in the immediate surrounding from a physical environment point of view, but also start tracking in terms of what is happening to you as an individual from a behavioral point of view. And then it comes to an imagination of people like you to see how do you take this and translate that into a business opportunity. We will of course talk a couple of examples that in an aging society where nursing care is very difficult to get, I'm talking about the Japanese society, right, where nursing care is very difficult to get, standard measurements of your health parameter like your BP, your sugar, etc. can all be measured and tracked by your own cell phone, and it can be sent directly to your doctor or to the hospital so that a regular log can be maintained at a fixed period of time, even when the person may forget or there is no other help to come and actually measure that for you. And that can obviously aid in terms of a health giving, which is important in an aging society, right? That's just an example of a kind of business that you can look when you start tracking some of these parameters. Correct? But when you look in terms of these technologies, I think we are talking about the opportunities or the potential of these technologies. But what we have to also keep in mind is what are some of the key constraints that we have to come across, and we have to solve these constraints. To our mind, there are three critical issues that we are talking about. The first issue is about energy management. And one of the technologies or the issues which all of us have always struggled when we as an individual look at our laptops or phone is battery usage, right? That's our pet peeve, that batteries don't last, right? And more you use, more fancy applications you download, the more your battery runs off, right? So today this is obviously a big issue. Now this is only talking from an IT perspective, but if you really look at it from an overall global energy consumption level, you will all agree that probably the rate at which we are currently burning our fossil fuels is obviously not sustainable, right? We are definitely going to run out, plus all the environmental ill effects that we are talking about. So increasingly the whole focus, and in advanced countries, and Japan clearly is in the forefront in terms of sustainable development, is this whole way in which you can start putting a cap on the total energy consumption of different industries. just not of the individual devices but of the overall industry as well. And therefore, I'm sure all of you are also reading about it. Sustainability becomes a very, very key factor. And I think if there is one opportunity I see for the next 50, 60 years as you people come into the work stream is very clearly around energy conservation, sustainability, renewable energies and so on and so forth. And I think if you talk specifically in device terms, we are talking about a whole new generation of energy coming in from areas like solar, vibration energy, thermocoupling, which is basically tapping into the temperature gradient and stuff like that, correct? So energy management, as you can all imagine, and I'm sure all of you are reading, becomes a very, very important management prerogative as we go forward, okay? The second is, as I said, changing demographics. Now, this is also becoming a very important factor because most countries in Europe, as you are aware of, are today in a declining growth rate, correct? They are not even having a replacement growth rate where you can sustain your current population level. They are actually declining. And that has again profound influences on the business because one of the debates or proponents of this whole outsourcing thing is you don't have enough people within your own countries to be able to do all your work, correct? So when you start talking about that, then there are also issues as we just talked about around healthcare. So we are talking about different societies. While Japan is foreseeing a future where almost everybody is going to be a very aged person, even a country like China, which adopted a one-child norm 30 years back, is now staring at a future where they have a very sharply declining working population. Keep in mind that in any society, it is only in the age group of 25 and 60 that you have an economically active and economically yielding population. Anything after that is a population that is living on the efforts and labor of the working population. And in this pyramid, more the pyramid becomes heavier. That means greater the percentage of people who are above the age of 60. It is a drain on society. And I'm sure all of you are reading that in United States, the healthcare reforms, the pension reforms are becoming bigger issues than anything else. And these are things which will perhaps, if not in the next 15, 20 years, maybe after that, will also become important issues in our own country. Okay? So that's a very, very critical factor we have to keep in mind, that we have to finally harness technology to be able to overcome this problem that we see, which is going to happen from aging populations across the globe. The third part is, of course, pertaining to security. And I'm sure all of you are aware that more amount of data that is out there in public domain. And now we are beginning to talk about very sensitive data, your blood pressure, your blood sugar levels. How much of it, where do you protect that data? How do you ensure that this data does not fall into the wrong hands? You practically have not only your position, which I think all of us can now track thanks to the GPS enablement, but the point is, today everything about you can be known, even to the extent of saying, are you feeling angry or happy at this point in time, right? Now, when you are talking about so much of data, the critical issue, of course, is privacy. The critical issue, of course, is how do you secure this data? So this is again a big topic, and this is a topic which will become more and more important because, as you know, data that we are all capturing, right, in whichever form, whether it's in a biometric form, whether it's in a physical form, is a data that is now getting stored, and there are issues in terms of how long you store the data, how long you archive the data, for how long do you have to keep it from a government or from a regulatory perspective. And there is a huge, huge issue that is now coming up in terms of how do you manage all this data. It is just not about storing alone, right? It is also your ability to retrieve the data at the right instant of time. Every time there is a terrorist attack, the whole government goes into a situation where you have to go back and trace all the calls that were made in a particular city, say in the last 48 hours, 50 hours, and so on and so forth. And you know the kind of pure technology challenges that these kind of issues are facing, and these are realities that we have to live with in the market, in the environment today. And of course, there are issues in terms of also protecting it against natural resources, against man-made disasters, against terrorist attacks, against actual hacking, and so on and so forth. Correct? So these are, to our mind, three critical issues, right, which we also have to keep in mind. So, around the environmental management today, there are multiple viewpoints in terms of how IT can help. Some of the examples are when we use IT, as usage of IT, it is obviously energy consuming, right? Especially when you talk of large data centers and so on and so forth. And there is a lot of research going on in terms of how do you bring down the electricity consumption of these data centers and large servers and storage and so on and so forth. But I think what is more critical is how do you use IT to be able to save energy, right? Because of the automation, because of the lot of sensing technologies that is now getting adapted. And there are a couple of examples at the end which we can talk about. I'm sure some of you are talking about, hearing about things like smart grid, right? You are hearing about concept like smart traffic control, right? Where you track on an online basis, on a real-time basis, of the total map of a particular city in terms of where the traffic builds up are, and then take a proactive action in terms of redirecting that traffic from areas where there are bottlenecks, thereby saving fuel, thereby making the whole thing more green, right? Or you can do it same way for electricity load dispatch, and I think all of you have read the disastrous consequences of not managing this well for the North Grid and the East Grid collapse that we had 3 weeks back. So the issue about IT is that IT becomes a very big enabler in terms of actually saving energy. And today when you talk about projects like smart grid, smart cities, smart traffic management, keep in mind that at every level there is an embedded IT that is going in. Okay? So this is one aspect of it. And these are some examples which I will rush through because these are just data points to show, some of the technologies that are getting talked about, like a cloud computer as an example, can have savings as much as 90% compared to standalone machines. Okay, I'm not getting into a technology discussion over here. Okay, so this savings can come from pure electricity consumption point of view. Savings also come because typically modern technology tends to be more space efficient, and as you know, one of the most expensive real estates are data centers, which you have where you have high precision air conditioning, high energy consumption, and if you can save space, obviously there is a lot of saving for the business. An example here which we have taken is the work that we have done with this Angio Kosi hospital, where by eliminating traditional films which you typically use for x-rays and other diagnostics, if you can store everything and share everything on an electronic media, obviously there is a huge amount of saving, and any saving in space or material directly translates into a saving in carbon dioxide emission. Correct? So these are examples of how in every sphere of human activity there is a possibility of using IT to be able to save energy, right? These are of course technologies which are now currently under evaluation, where the physical movement of your hand can power your mobile phone, right? And I'm sure all of you can relate this back to 20-30 years back when Citizen introduced the first automatic watch, where just the hand movement kept your watch going. There is no reason why that same movement cannot power the next generation of your mobile phones, correct? Or it can be a combination of light, converting light into energy, and could be sunlight or any other ambient light, plus a combination of vibration, right? So these are examples of where you combine both sensor and a transmitter all in one in a single device, and you kind of generate electricity and energy and also consume electricity all in the same device, correct? Similarly, when you talked, I think this example we have already talked about, where you can actually record what you're eating, what your body temperatures are, etc., and send it back to your registered nurse or dietitian, and get an online feedback in terms of what you're doing, what you're not doing correctly. Okay? So we talked about this as an example. I think this is something which all of you can very easily correlate to, because there's a product right here in the Indian market, the Eyeball adult, you have seen, right, for senior citizens, a phone which is with large numbers, with an emergency dial numbers and so on and so forth. So the point is that these have consequences also in terms of how you design product. I mean, we all know that for elderly people, you have to design products which has to cater to that market. Now, traditionally, we have always designed products which cater to younger people, right? And if you take the traditional Indian marketing theories, if you take almost every brand communication, it is about addressing the aspirations of a younger person. But you have to also realize that there is probably market opportunities where you can address to maybe people like me who are no longer young, or to even more elderly people where there are special needs in terms of how they live their life. And these are market opportunities, and I'm sure some of you have also noticed that I think there was Thomas Cook or one of these agencies which recently had an ad which very specifically talked about a post-retirement couple taking out a holiday. I don't remember exactly which, right? But some of you might remember, right? So I think these are all, again, examples of market segmentation, and some of the segments which previously people thought may not be a big segment, but as we saw, as the pyramid inverts, can become big segments as we go forward, correct? So these are examples which can also have big consequences, not only for product design, but also in terms of how we do our marketing communications. Now, this is something which is, as I said, an example which is so typical Japanese, right? Now, in Japan or in United States, as an example, you have very big farms, right? You have farms which are actually literally kilometers on length. And, it is very difficult for a farmer to cover that field by walking, right? So if he has to find out if in a remote part of his field whether the corn is ready for harvesting or not, today he has to physically take a tractor, drive up to that place, check out actually the status of how the crop is, come back and then take his harvester and go and harvest, right? But here we are talking about a protein-based, the reflection of the sunlight on a corn ripe, not only in terms of the color, but more importantly in terms of the state of the protein, can be detected by a satellite overhead. And based on the satellite image, you can actually see the protein content and then take a decision whether that particular crop is ready for harvesting or not. So you actually save yourself the trouble of taking your harvester out and traveling a few kilometers. So in one way of also looking at it, again, this fosters a green technology. But these are examples which in the Indian context where labor is cheap and farms are small, obviously we can't even correlate. But the point is that these are some of the advanced technology work that is going on abroad. Okay, and I think we talked about some of the safety and security issues. Again, once we get into the details of it, you can all imagine this will become a fairly complex matter. So I'll just skip this through very, very quickly because I think what I want to therefore bring together is, today if you look in terms of what a company like Fujitsu is doing, is we are playing a role in practically all these areas that you see. I think all of you are probably aware that till very recently the world's largest supercomputer was actually a Fujitsu computer, which was called the K computer. And it can really be used for literally in hundreds and hundreds of ways. See, one of the areas where today all companies want to cut cost is in actual development of a product and testing. And you are aware, for example, in the pharma industry, it can be a very, very expensive process when you go through this whole process of clinical trials, right? Now, question is if you can simulate some of these molecules and you can do some of these trials on a statistical basis, then it can have serious advantage in terms of time to market, correct? And you know that today drug design, molecule design are big areas of high performance computing research, right? When you introduce a new model of car, it has to go through very rigorous safety and emission test, right? Now, there is only so much you can do in actual models. A lot of it you today do on computer simulations, correct? And we are all aware of the kind of work that gets done where, every single car goes through multiple rounds of crash analysis, roadworthiness test, etc., which obviously cuts down the total cost of production of the car and therefore makes it more affordable to people, correct? So there are many such examples where I think the power of computers in terms of creating an intelligent and a human-centric society becomes very, very critical. But the most important part to keep in mind is it is really a combination of three things: mobile communication technology, a widespread usage of sensors which can track different type of environmental and behavioral parameters, and the fact that high-end computing today gets into the cloud, which very simply means that these are shareable. People don't have to invest in individual infrastructure and therefore their costs can be minimized because you drive an utilization and therefore your cost comes down. So that in essence is what we are talking about in the form of human-centric computing. So that was friends what I had to share with you in terms of how the IT industry has evolved in the Indian context, how we see some of the IT leaders across the world adapting to the new technology, what are some of the frontiers of research that companies like Fujitsu is engaging in. And we have also shared with you some of the thoughts in terms of where we see the technology headed and what kind of business opportunities that throws up for young people who are now coming into the world stream. So that was from my side. If there are any questions, I'll be very happy to take them. Huh? Sure. At this time. Okay, sure. Okay. Yeah, sure.
thank you for this presentation. The thing is, when it comes to the IT in the Indian context and the current trends, the questions were here we wanted to ask you, but you've already covered that.
Okay.
So we'll move on a little bit. We'll take questions from the audience later.
Sure.
Now the thing is, when it comes to leadership, you've journeyed from Wipro to Fujitsu. It's been a long journey, sir. How has your managerial style evolved over the years?
I don't think I've consciously ever adopted a particular managerial style, but if you go back and look in terms of what worked for me when I was, I had a manager and I was a young rookie in Wipro, is a few things. To me, the manager's personal involvement in your development. Let me share one thing. I think the most important person who impacts your life is your boss. It sounds a little blasphemous. Sometimes people even put a boss higher than your spouse, but that's the reality. The fact of the matter is 80% of your waking hours you are in an office environment, right? If you have a good boss, you can manage. Balance 20% at home, you can manage your spouse, correct? The important thing is to have a good boss. And I cannot, tell you how important it is to get the right boss at the right time of your career, right? And to be very honest, I am personally indebted to a gentleman called V. Ramkumar, who was my second manager. My first manager, I must share with you, was not a great example of a manager. I'll tell you the reason why I'm saying that. He never took up interest in my personal development. And if any time, I'm sure all of you people have experience over here, but I'm sure you will agree that, the first year or two, the amount of mentoring that you need, because you are really out of a college environment, right? You really want to understand how organizations work. And it is just not about the job in hand, but in terms of understanding the overall business, the overall organizational culture. And I think if you have a good boss or a good senior colleague who can mentor you, I think that becomes very, very critical. So with this background in mind, for me, also I take mentoring quite seriously. And to the extent possible, I do spend time with all the people cutting across boundaries, because one of the other things, and this is again, I'm very indebted to Wipro in terms of their culture, it was not a hierarchical culture. I think one reason, of course, is in those early days when you're a 20 crore high-tech industry, there were obviously no major hierarchical barriers. As an industry, as a small group of people, we all worked together. We had access to very senior people like Dr. Mitta. I talked about Mr. Ashok Soota, who is very well known to all of you. So, these people we had ready access to, and it was absolutely a super experience to see them work up front and close, and, get some of these values together. And today I can say without any hesitation that a lot of what I am today is definitely those first 7 years of grounding that I had in terms of my values, in terms of the customer orientation, in terms of ensuring that, whatever happens, your commitment to the customer stays. One of the things which Mr. Premji used to talk to us, and I think it is very relevant, he says, please commit what you can deliver and deliver what you can commit, right? And I'm sure some of you may have again heard about this, but I think it's such a true statement. And I find, and let me share with you, as I have grown older, this is a value, unfortunately, I'm finding now declining. Today we are somehow coming into a situation where people tend to value only the written word. To me, a gentleman or a lady's word, a verbal word should be good enough. If you are not worth your word, what character are we talking about? Correct? And I think, therefore, it is also an equal, in as much as the other person should trust your word, it is equally important for you to get that trust, to build that trust by delivering on what you have committed. So you have to be equally careful in terms of what you are committing, so that you know that I can deliver what I am committing on. I think this is a value which I would really like the new generation to take it up, because at the end of the day, team, you are all human beings. No business is done on the basis of technology. Business is done on the basis of relationships that you build. And a person sitting across the table will only respect you if he sees you keep to your commitments, he sees some value in terms of you teaching him something by the way of either a new technology or a new business or something, right? But it is very important for each one of us to earn that personal trust and respect of that opposite person. If you can't do that, I don't know what this education is all about. I'm making it very strong, but I really feel very strongly.
Thank you, sir. Now the thing is, you've been a part of the top brass for a while now, seeing the industry grow and all of that. I'm sure you've had more than your fair share of stress to deal with. So how do you cope with your stress?
Part of the answer is, in what I just said. I think when you get into a relationship where you say he's not my subordinate, he's
right.
I'm mentoring him in some respect, he's a friend, right? I think in that sense it also helps to share out the stress levels. Okay. Second thing, which of course which is very important, I'm sure probably everybody who comes on this forum shares, I think family life is very critical.
Okay.
You must take time out for your families, because that is something which everybody says, and as you grow older you realize
So
that is very, very important.
How do you balance the work?
No, I think, at the end of the day, there is only so much work that you can do or should do. Let's be very clear about it. There is nothing that tells you to take a phone call at 9 o'clock in the night. If a phone rings on your dinner table, all you have to say is, I'm having dinner. First of all, you can make an informal communication. Today, for example, unless there is an absolute emergency, I don't like taking calls after 9 o'clock. Till 9 o'clock I'm available, but after 9 o'clock I would not like to take calls, right? But what I also ensure is that even if I'm not taking calls and there is, supposing that right now I'm sitting here, I put my phone in a silent mode, I will ensure that if there are 5 missed calls, I will ensure that I will take that effort of answering every one of those missed calls. That way a person knows that if he calls and he misses me, he knows for sure I'm going to call back. Okay, so this is important. So I think it is up to you to lay down the ground rules of what works for you.
Okay.
Right. And I think even those old-fashioned values that we talk about, that a family that eats together, stays together, etc., I think it all works. So take that time. It is entirely up to you. Take your vacations. Nobody in the world can stop you from taking your vacations. Take your vacations. Because the problem is, if you don't do that, then you have the risk of burning out. And that is something which obviously none of us want. Stress is there. And obviously, which I would also, there are 2 more things which I want to say here. One is, I think it's very important to see the bigger picture. Always try and see the big picture of the work you are doing. Because, sometimes you get caught up in a very small matter, which if you look at it from a big perspective would then say, it's so trivial, why am I getting so worked up about it, right? So it is always important, I think, to keep the context of the problem or context of the work you are doing in hand, right? And I think hand in hand with this is, don't take yourself too seriously. Learn to laugh at yourself. I think it's very, very critical. Okay.
So can you just elaborate what your typical day is like? Because you mentioned after 9 you don't like taking work calls.
Yeah, I can share with you my daily routine. As you can see, I have a weight problem. So I have been advised, and I genuinely also enjoy walking. So I get up at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
I go for a 35-40 minute walk. Then I come back and do a small meditation. It helps. I can also share that with you. I never used to do it till I was about 40. So meditation helps. So if you, I don't know if your campus offers that thing in your course curriculum, but this was not there when we were students. People didn't even use the word meditation when we were students. We all felt it. Early 20s, you don't need to meditate. But fact of the matter is, if you do, it helps, right? And it has nothing to do with religion. It is just a question of getting connected with the other things in life.
Right.
I think you do that, spend 10 minutes in meditation, come to office. I start the day early because I get bugged caught in a traffic.
Okay,
I think you just spoil your mood if you get stuck in early morning traffic. So I leave home at 7:30, by 8:59 I'm in office. You also get the first 1 hour very productive, because you can then set your agenda for the day. You can finish off on some of the more pressing tasks where before the phone calls start ringing. And then you work from 8 o'clock till 8:39 in the evening.
It's very
8:39 in the evening.
It's very important to have.
I also read a lot in the night, and so if you go back home and then you want to relax, for me personally, the relaxation is reading.
So what's the current book on your bedside table?
So I must tell you a very interesting book which I read. Just finished reading over this weekend. I don't know if you people have this book. If you don't, I would strongly recommend you have it in your library. It's called The Moral Molecule.
Okay.
Have you heard of this book?
No.
Oh, it's a very fascinating subject. Let me spend a minute because I'm so impressed with this book. This is a book called The Moral Molecule by a gentleman called Paul Zaks. This gentleman trained as an economist, and then he studied further in neurosciences, and today he is the only professor who runs a Department of Neuroeconomics.
Wow.
Okay, the entire research is on a hormone which is released by, typically it was a hormone associated with a woman when a woman breastfeeds the baby, and it is called oxytocin. I don't know if some of you have a medical background, you will know this, right? And oxytocin is a hormone which has been proven to generate trust and openness and empathy in the person, and this happens with both male and female. It has nothing to do with a particular gender, right? And there are situations that trigger off the production of oxytocin, and it is this molecule which typically causes us to be a generous, ethical person, right? And this whole book actually goes on to say, and there is obviously like an economist, he has done his game theory, he has done different gaming in different type of scenarios and taken blood samples of people all the time, before, after, in different types of situation. And it does go back to explain some of these things that I'm talking about. I mean, it also talks about the power of hugging. He has a indirect reference to Mata Anandamayi, I'm sure. Yeah, so, you know, even a physical touch of a human being than a physical contact. And I think part of it is because as human beings, we just relate to the human. So this is a very fascinating book, and I think all of you will just enjoy reading. So one of my passions is now to see how science and spirituality gets connected. You know, a lot of these things which we read as being taught to us by spiritual leaders and so on and so forth, actually has a very strong scientific basis. And I think every day we keep reading that, you know, when you meditate, the kind of, brain waves that you get, the kind of hormone production, the kind of, absolutely. I think that's the kind of thing. And therefore, when we talked about the topic of meditation, it is today on a very firm scientific basis. It is not a fad. It is not something which only elderly people need to do. I think even young people need to do.
I think it's really nice when you can show to a scientific base
absolutely. See, most of us have that background. I think a lot of you may be engineering student over here. Somewhere in the back of our mind, we all like to believe we are very rational, we have a scientific, and we will not we will not accept something which is absolute.
Which doesn't have a base. So.
Correct. So read these books. I think that gives you a very strong scientific basis.
The Moral Molecule.
I'm just giving as an example.
Definitely. We spoke about values and the worth of a spoken word and all of that. So I'm going to ask you this question because we've spoken about it when I met you last. It said Bollywood at some point has been pivotal in shaping value systems. So if you could elaborate on that, because Bollywood is an integral part of everyone's life, but when it shapes value systems, of course.
I mean, you take any recent example, like I'm sure a lot of you have seen the movie Lagan, right? All of you have seen the movie Chak De India, right? I think these are some of, I'm not sure if these are part of your course curriculum as well, because these are extremely inspirational movies and there's a lot of messages in terms of developing leadership styles and so on and so forth. But the movies I'm talking about are the movies when I grew up, which was in the 70s. And to my mind, that is the golden era of Hindi movies. And if you really see those movies, and I'm talking about movies from Hrishikesh Mukherjee, Gulzar, that type of directors, most of these movies had a very social setting, right? And there was also a movie where there was a lot of empathy in that movie between the characters. Right? And somewhere or the others, if you really go back and look at it, they always promoted very strong values amongst friends, values about relationships, values about ethical behavior and stuff like that. The thought process which I have, and you people are all young people, you can share that with me. One slightly disturbing trend I find, and my son is now in third year engineering, so a lot of you read a lot of fantasy books, Harry Potter as an example. I'm not too sure if that kind of books, though of course Harry Potter, I have also read a couple of them and there is a strong ethical underlying messages. But sometimes I feel that maybe the young generation is too much into this world of make-believe and, not as much of real grounding, but maybe that's a generation gap I'm talking about here. So I'm open, maybe you people have a different perspective, but I personally felt that, and when you have to pick up these cues, since to my mind, therefore humanities plays a very critical role. Because, finally, if it is all about relationship, finally it is all about judgment. Right? When you judge a situation, it is not a binary 0-1. There are incredible nuances, right? How do you get to these nuances? How do you establish a cross-cultural linkage in a global world unless there are some common talking points? You have to know the history, the geography, the culture, the religion, of the other person you're doing business with. And that brings you back to humanities. I personally think that over the last 20-25 years, we have swung too much into the areas of science and engineering and technology and not paid enough attention to humanities. This is my personal belief. You people can feel otherwise. And
I completely agree with you. I'm from a humanities background.
I know you are.
So I completely agree. Another interesting thing is that with each day, India is getting more and more globalized. We opened our doors a long time back, but I think with each day we're just opening our doors wider. Do you think our management students, our students for that matter, who become our professionals, do you think they're at par with the global standards?
See, it's always a slightly difficult question to answer. In our company right now, when I work, we are a Japanese company, but we report into Europe. And this is also my first experience of working with Europeans.
Okay.
Because if you see Hewlett Packard and Dell, these were all American companies, so I really didn't have an experience of working with the Europeans. And I can tell you there are very strong cultural differences between American, a European and a Japanese.
Okay.
To my mind, as a student, there is only so much of a global, in a period of 2 years with your own academic pressures, how much of experience can you actually get, right? I think a lot of this experience will come when you start working, because by definition, whether in a multinational company or in an Indian company, you will have enough and more exposure to globalization. But I think what helps you definitely is reading, because that prepares you mentally what to expect. But of course, then you have the actual interface when you travel abroad or you're meeting a visitor from overseas. Just keep your mind open, absorb whatever you can, and that is how you prepare yourself. The basic of human nature, to my mind, is not very different, right? Culturally, there are some differences. For example, I'll just give you a simple example. When you run a services business, for example, in IT, in an Indian company, you say, I will give you a 99% uptime, and as long as you deliver that 99% uptime, it is good enough. So you keep a track how many failures I had, how much time I took to respond, and so on and so forth. Good, that's enough. That's what an Indian customer is going to ask for. In Toyota, where we provide service, it is just not enough for me to meet that 99%. For every failure that happens, there is a root cause analysis that needs to get done. Because the whole idea is you should never repeat that failure or the mistake. And to me, this is a big cultural issue, because in India, we just never think like that. As long as we are doing 99%, we believe we are happy, right?
Yeah.
But we never go and see how can I ensure that that 1% can become 0.1%, right? And that's the Japanese culture, right? And this is giving as a simple example to illustrate the point. And I think this is something you can only learn when you're there in the field. Keep your mind open, and to me, it's a great learning experience. I would not have had this when I was working in an American company. So this is, I think, read, meet with people, keep an open mind. While we should be proud of our own civilization, our own values, keep in mind that others are also, known less. I think we should respect that and learn. Let's pick up the best from the world. That's the opportunity.
Thank you, sir. Okay, now let us quickly move on to 2-3 rapid fire questions.
Oh my God.
Really light, keeping it really light now.
Okay.
Who's the CEO at home?
My wife.
Okay, which is your favorite book of all time?
My favorite book of all time is a book again a book that kind of connects spirituality and science. A book called The Codename God. I don't know if you people have read it.
Okay.
Mani Bhaumic. He is the pioneer of LASIK surgery.
Yeah.
Okay, and he was a student. He was the first PhD of IIT Kharagpur. Extremely rich guy, settled in the United States, and it's personally his biography, and also his journey into the world of trying to connect science and spirituality. Again, a book I would strongly recommend to all of you who have an interest in that area.
Okay, sir, Sachin or Federer? Sachin Tendulkar or Roger Federer?
Federer.
So who's your role model? One person who's influenced you from the beginning?
I remember I mentioned the name of a gentleman called V. Ramkumar.
Yeah.
As a manager, I clearly have learnt a lot from him, and I think his way of managing, his way of co-opting you, mentoring you is something which I have really always admired. The second person I've really learnt a lot is Balu Doraiswamy, who was the previous MD of Hewlett Packard. And what I learned from Balu are two things. One is absolute customer focus. For Balu, no internal process issues had any meaning if you are unable to solve a customer's problem. Okay, that is something which is so very important, because we often get caught up in internal issues of an organization. It has no meaning unless you are able to solve a customer's problem. The second thing which I learned from him is, in any situation, to take a complete 360-degree view, because often you take a decision based on maybe 2 inputs or 3 inputs, but there may be 3 or 4 other perspectives which are very important to the final decision, but you often tend to neglect. So taking a 360-degree view of a situation and customer first, I think these are 2 great values which I got from Bala.
So what's the craziest memory from your college days?
Playing table tennis after having bunk.
Oh wow! We have a lot of table tennis enthusiasts. Well, with night you see people playing table tennis. Okay, live to eat, eat to live.
I think right now my situation is live to eat.
Okay, and the last one, economic times, business standard.
For me, it's economic.
Thank you, sir. We can now open for some questions with us.
I hope I'm not keeping you people late.
No, absolutely not. These are rare opportunities that we get.
Please feel free to ask questions. I can stand so that you can all see me. I'm a short guy, so if I sit on a sofa, you can't see me at all. Any questions? Yeah, please. Yes. Okay, I can send you some separate paper on that. Okay, I would not like to get into a very technical discussion on this one.
A very good evening, sir. My name is Vedang.
Yes,
so my question to you is that we have 2 styles of management. One is the American, which is more individual oriented, and the Japanese style. My question to you, sir, is that where does Indian style of management fit? As in, is it more inclined towards the United States or Japan?
Very interesting question. I think your point is very, very good question. This is a question which has also been there on my mind, that maybe we should, the fact of the matter is, because our academic, coursework is largely American oriented. A lot of cases we do Americans. Fortunately, unfortunately, most of the companies we work in India are also American companies. Obviously, America has a disproportionate share in terms of our management thought processes. Okay? But it is also a fact that, now that I've been working in a Japanese company for 3 years, there are some very interesting insights, as I just shared with you, which I'm picking up from Japan. To my mind, and I was reading a book recently which is called The Indian Way. I'm sure you have all read that book, right? And it actually talks about some of the unique capabilities about the Indian leadership style. And there are 2 specific points I can recall right now. One is, again, looking at the big picture, right? One of the most influential management gurus has been Mr. C.K. Prahalad and his bottom of the pyramid analysis. And I think you can rattle off any number of examples. I think it's a very Indian thought which has now captured the imagination of the world, right? This whole concept of building up a business or a fortune by tracking or tapping into the market at the bottom of pyramid, I think it's an Indian management thought which has now caught people's imagination. So to your point, I would come straight away and say 100%. And I think it's people like you who must evolve a very definitive Indian management philosophy. And this is important because, again, go back to our spiritual roots. Go back to the fact that India has a only living civilization amongst all countries of the world, right? I think there are points which we need to take from that and obviously marry that with the reality. See, it's also a fact that India is an extraordinarily demanding market. India is a demanding market for multiple reasons. One is, of course, the bottom of the pyramid economics, right? You have, at the end of the day, a very poor country with very limited purchasing power. We are also a society which is born and brought up on the value of thrift, which is why we start using a good or a product long after its expiry date. We just keep stretching it till it actually breaks, right? We do that, right? We are a country of jugaad, which all of you are now reading about, right? Because there are so many impediments that unless you can find quick fixes and move around, we can't do it. And I can tell you, compared to an American manager or a European manager, I think our perspectives are far broader, right? But what we miss out, and this is something we need to pick up, we are not as detailed. We are not as detailed, right? We don't deliver what we commit. Very, very critical. And these are, I think, things if we can pick up, then we take the best of what's happening outside, what's happening in India. And 100%, excellent question. I think we should have a definitive Indian way of management. And I think it is a testimony. Today you see so many Indian leaders of multinationals who are now becoming global leaders, right? And I think it's somewhere, obviously, they are affecting. Nobody gets a job in that position, obviously not because of our skin color, right? So despite of our skin color, if you're getting that position, it obviously shows you're bringing some values. I think we tend to be much more patient as people. We tend to be able to manage ambiguity much better. Call it the jugaad factor, call it otherwise. I think the kind of ambiguous environment that we work in, it's very difficult. For a German, as an example, everything has to be black and white. He just cannot tolerate any grey. For us, everything is grey. There is no white, there is no black. It's only shades, right? So, I think we manage ambiguity much better. Correct? So, I think these are the nuances, and the world is becoming more and more grey. Right? And I think if you can succeed in a very demanding environment like India, I think you will succeed in a lot of other emerging markets.
Do we have any more questions?
Yes, please.
Good evening, sir. Myself, Harshal Vyas. Thank you for sharing such great insights and from your journey from Wipro to Fujitsu. So I would like to ask you one question. Like you have been having niche skills in sales and marketing throughout the journey. So which were the striking factors, which led you to set such a great benchmark in industry?
Listen. When you go and talk to a customer, don't talk. Listen. Okay, I think listening skills are very, very, very critical. It's very, very critical. You must, before you talk, you must listen, right? And I think if you listen, then you get everything. See, it's very important. Again, when you listen, you're not listening to the words alone, right? You're listening to his body language. You're trying to read a meaning between what he's actually trying to say, and that is how you build that connection. Right? So listening skills are very critical.
I think we have one more question, sir.
Good evening, sir. My name is Namrita. It's very inspiring to actually listen to leaders like you speak. Just extending the thought which you actually gave us, I'm very sure many people, when we go into the corporate industry after our academics, may not be getting such a mentor like boss. So I just want to know, when we face such kind of a challenge, what is the action plan we should take? Or if you could share some leaves of experience, some leaves from your book of experience as to how you went about, or how you tackled with a person like that as your boss, or how we should go about it.
No, so let me share with you. I think it's again a very, very practical question, because as I said, boss is very important, but what happens if you don't get a good boss? That's right? It's a 50% probability, right? It can either be good or not good, right? So, one of the things is look out for a senior colleague. Again, it all comes down to building a trust and a relationship, right? So reach out. First of all, if you don't reach out, then nobody else will reach out. So reach out, and if you don't get that support and mentorship from your direct manager, maybe you can get a support or mentorship from a senior colleague or another person in the organization, right? But again, in every relationship there is give and take, right? So also be very aware that you have to also give something into the relationship, right? So if you do that, I think we all do that, consciously, unconsciously, day in and day out, we are always building relationship, right? Amongst our friend circle, family circle, with customers, with professors, and so on and so on. But it's the same skills. Just be clear on one thing, that build your own personal trust and credibility. I find that to be very important. I think it's very important. When I think oftentimes human beings make a mistake by thinking that I'm very smart, I'm thinking on my feet and I can outwit that other person. At that moment, probably you can, right? But in the long run, that guy catches up. He catches up, and once he figures out that you have taken him for a ride, that's the end of the relationship, right? Keep that in mind. I don't think anybody is so dumb that he can't figure out, right? You will figure out sooner or later, maybe not sooner, but later. But just imagine the consequence when the person figures out on the other side that you have actually taken that person. So therefore, to my mind, and this is unfortunately a very Indian tendency, right? We have that. We know people do that day in and day out. And to my mind, that is the bane of our society. We just believe we are too smart. And I don't think anybody is that smart that you can completely outwit anybody and the other guy doesn't even know that he has been outwitted. Sooner or later the person catches up and then